and good morning. I think our participants are now joining the Mind Before Acts virtual roundtable. Welcome to everybody. We are about ready, I think, to kick off the session today. We've got quite a good audience. I see we have 39 people joining us so far, and I'm excited to kick off this discussion about the potential of technology in fighting radicalism. So I'd like to welcome you all here today for our discussion. We've heard, I think, a lot about violent extremists mobilizing technology for their own sort of nefarious purposes, but not nearly enough about how society can use that technology against these criminals. So before we begin digging into this a little further, I'm going to introduce myself. My name's Lorraine Wilkinson. I work for the European Organization for Security, which represents companies operating in the security technology sphere. And we're partners in the Mind Before Act project, which is funded by the EU under the H2020 programme. And you are going to be hearing a little bit more about the project from my colleague Carola shortly. But before we begin, I want to share a little bit more about our agenda for today, so you know what's coming, and I'll cover some housekeeping issues for today's discussion. So I'm going to just show you the agenda slide, which should give you an idea of the programme for this morning. So we've got a lot to cover. We're going to do a little introduction to the project so you know what we're talking about, and then we're going to launch into our panel discussions with some really interesting speakers. I can't wait to share with you a little bit more about that. So our first panel is looking at how technologies are being utilised to combat radicalism and violent extremism, particularly through some of the examples that have been gathered through the findings of the Mind Before Act project, the pilot studies that have been run. And we will also be talking to some of the users of this technology. So with that, we'll be following it with a Q&A with you, our virtual audience. And after a short refueling for caffeination, which I think will be important this morning, we'll open our second panel, which builds on the first by looking at how policy can actually further encourage CVE technologies. This will be then followed by another Q&A with you all, so don't worry, you'll get to have your say. Put your thinking caps on for those questions you might have for our panelists. Obviously, we want to make this discussion as interactive as possible. It's not always easy when there's lots of people that are interested to contribute. So what we've organised for this morning is if you would like to feed into the discussion, you can do so in two ways. The first is we're going to be holding a poll before each of the Q&A sessions to get your perspective on the topic that's been discussed. So we'll share the results of those polls at the end of the Q&A. And secondly, obviously, we'd like to hear your questions as they come in. So you can share those through two ways, via the @MindBeforeAct Twitter account. So you can tweet at us with your questions, or you can do it directly through the webinar chat function, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen. You can share your questions with the entire audience if you're happy to do so, or if you prefer to keep your identity private, you can share your question with the organisers only. And we're going to share as many questions as possible with our panelists. We do have limited time, so we might be selective, or we might bunch some questions together, but we will do our best to cover as much ground as possible. So enough talk from me. We're going to launch into our discussion with a little introduction from my co-organizer Carola from Elcano, who will tell you a little bit more about the project behind today's discussion. So over to you, Carola.
Good morning, and thanks, Lorraine, for your kind presentation. So as scientific coordinator of Mind Before Act project, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this virtual roundtable on the potential of technology in the fight against radicalism, organized in collaboration with our associated partner, ENLETS, the European Network of Law Enforcement Technology Services. Initially, this event should have been a face-to-face meeting, but in the current context of COVID-19, we turned into a webinar, which, seen in the positive side, allow us to reach a larger potential audience in order to share and discuss our research results on the topic at hand today. As Lorraine said, Mind Before Act is an H2020 project led by the Spanish think tank Elcano Royal Institute, which I am part of as senior analyst in the program on violent radicalization and global terrorism. The project is focused on developing a comprehensive approach to violent radicalization within Europe. It started in 2017 and will end next August. This 3-year project counts with the participation of other 16 partners from 9 different countries, including Austria, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and the United Kingdom. Mind Before Act was conceived as a very practical and policy-oriented project. Our aim is twofold. First, improving the already existing European PCB practices in 4 key areas, specifically prisons, schools, local initiatives, and the internet and the media, through the design, implementation, and evaluation of 16 small-scale interventions or pilot projects based on a needs-assessed approach. The second is creating a European network of highly prepared stakeholders from very different backgrounds. Of course, we clearly want to work to have an impact on policy making. This is why during this last year of the project, we organized events throughout Europe on relevant issues in the PCB realm. Such expert roundtables and policy events enable us to discuss our results and knowledge with other high-level experts like you from Europe and other regions, because we believe that cooperation and interchanges are pivotal to elaborate more comprehensive and well-informed policy recommendations. Of these exchanges, in the editing of policy briefs and reports, which will improve future European actions within PCB and are already available in our website. But throughout the project, a particular focus has been given to technology. Excuse me. In addition to having developed an ad hoc platform to host the already mentioned stakeholder network, the consortium has dealt with the potential of technology in the field of prevention and countering violent radicalization as well. In this context, today, as Lorraine also mentioned before, we celebrate this webinar aiming to present the project's major results in terms of technology and open a debate on the real potential it has on the fight against radicalism. In this sense, this morning, we will present 3 of the main achievements regarding technology addressed within the project, with R, an original database on existing technologies in the PCB field developed by EOS, virtual reality scenarios created by our British partner CENTRIC to support law enforcement agencies in primary and secondary prevention, and last but not least, of course, the potential of technologies for detection tested in a pilot project developed by Agenfor in the particular context of prisons. But this event is also an opportunity to stress the need for cooperation between both the public and the private sectors for better responses tackling violent radicalization. In this sense, this event aims also to strengthen links among different actors and backgrounds involved in PCB issues. Before giving the floor to Lorraine again, I would like to thank all the speakers for sharing their experience with us today. Endless national contacts, Mrs. Rosalia Maxine from the Ministry of Interior in Spain, who helped us with the organization of the event, and the Belgian project partner, EOS, of course, without whom this event won't be possible. In this sense, I would like to give a special thanks to my colleague Lorraine Wilkinson for her extraordinary work in organizing this event, and to Mind Before Act's project manager, Virginia Cinelli, for her effort and dedication. Finally, of course, many thanks to all of you for joining us today. We hope this meeting will be just the starting point for further collaboration, and so we encourage you to follow our work through the website as well as our social media profiles in Twitter or LinkedIn. I wish you a very fruitful morning, and I give the floor to Lorraine for the first panel. So thank you so much, Lorraine.
Thank you, Carola. That's provided everyone, I think, with a really thorough basis for the discussions today, where we stand with the project, and we are going to learn a little bit more about it. So I'm not going to chat too much, but I'm going to give you a little briefing on our first panel, which we will launch now, which will be looking at the practical applications of technologies in counter-radicalisation and some of the future trends. We've got some great speakers. I'd like to share a little bit more about them with you now, and then we can get on with the discussions. So our first speaker is Alice Raven, who joins us from our project partner, CENTRIC. So CENTRIC, for those of you that don't know, is the Centre of Excellence in Terrorism, Resilience, Intelligence and Organised Crime Research, an institute at the Sheffield Hallam University. She is a seasoned researcher with a very strong focus on criminology and technology. And Alice is going to be sharing some of the critical technologies used in the Mind Before Act pilot studies. Her presentation is going to be followed by our second speaker, Patrick Padding, who is a chairman of the European Network of Law Enforcement Technology Services, ENLETS, in other words, the short and snappy version. Patrick is a Dutch police official with over 30 years of experience in law enforcement, so some real perspective there. And he's striving as the chairman of ENLETS to make it the leading European platform that strengthens police cooperation and bridges the gap between the users and providers of law enforcement technology. So Patrick will be talking to you about end user requirements from CVE technologies. And I'd like to say a big thank you to both of us for joining us today. I'm not going to hold back too much longer, but I would like to refer very briefly to an exercise which was undertaken within the Mind Before Act project, which was effectively a deep dive into CVE technology, or the landscape of CVE technology. And the EOS team drew on its contacts in the security technology industry to explore what tools were actually available currently to end users in the fight against radicalisation. And what we did is we aggregated the results of these findings into a database, which I'm excited to say will shortly be digitalised, and you'll be able to find that on the Mind Before Act information sharing platform. So that's www.counterradicalisation.eu, and that's radicalisation with an S. So if you want to go and check that out, it should be up and running over the course of the summer. So the database effectively is made up of technologies ranging from the simplest, if you can say it's simplest, but simplest open source data mining to public sentiment analysis, and deep web monitoring to more complex AI-enabled data dissemination platforms. So there's a real overview of what's out there. We did run a sort of simple SWOT analysis of these technologies, and I'm sure we'll discuss this further during the conversations here, but we did identify some key challenges that these tools offered. Challenges such as integration and compatibility with user systems, compliance with GDPR rules, training requirements for users. I mean, there's a whole host of issues, but there are also some very positive outcomes in terms of the tools available. There are opportunities and there's innovation coming out of this, and I think that's a good point to sort of hand over to Alice, who's going to share some more about the Mind Before Act project's finalized results from the PSNI Loyalist Republican and the hate speech virtual reality scenarios. So Alice, over to you. I will let you present your results. Thank you.
Thanks, and hi everyone. I'm just waiting to be able to share my screen. I think Virginia is probably doing that in the background as we speak, so just bear with me 2 seconds. So hopefully, is my screen sharing now? Yeah, okay. So I guess I wanted to speak with you all today about the technologies we've been developing as part of Mind Before Act to create more engaging and interactive ways of countering radicalisation. And in particular, I want to share a quick screenshot with you of 2 virtual reality scenarios we've made based on the pilot projects we conducted last year, which are 2 very different methods of how you can use virtual reality to counter radicalisation. So I guess to begin with, we conducted 2, they're called Living Labs, but I'd say the more sort of discussion workshops. We held in Belfast and Sheffield in the UK last year. And what we wanted to do was work with different radicalisation experts, including law enforcement, security experts, local community experts, and prevention experts to understand the current challenges they face on the internet and media. So we had a couple of conclusions, or main findings, as you'd say, from this. So we found that the internet is an enabler of new capabilities for radicalisation. In particular, the participants mentioned that the rise of privacy by design applications such as Telegram and Gab have become really difficult in trying to spot radicalisation, and through their privacy by design approaches, it's really difficult to get involved and even conduct often investigations in these areas. The second point is that young people are identified as particularly at risk when exercising online, which is not a new finding and has been discussed widely previously by academia. However, they did mention that prevention within education is key, and that if we take a stronger focus on the educational sector and taking into account their authority, we can help to promote best practices in this area. Thirdly, we found that extremist influencers are taking centre stage. So we found that far-right extremist groups in particular, certain individuals are adopting the social media influencer characteristics, which may be building up larger audiences by integrating mainstream culture into their ideologies and trying to mix extremists with mainstream culture together to build large networks of support, which can be really effective in attracting larger audiences and spreading fake news and disinformation. We also found that law enforcement in particular continue to struggle to share information with and gather information from grassroots and hard to reach communities with information about counter-radicalisation. But I guess the most important for the Mind Before Act project is that there is an increasing demand for future technologies such as virtual reality to provide a more engaging and practical training methods. So for taking this into account, we developed 2 virtual reality scenarios. So based on the Belfast discussion workshop we held, we created a scenario that was specified towards the current conflicts in Ireland around loyalist and Republican military groups. So we decided to create a 2-in-1 virtual reality room, which you can walk through the 3 different phases of the radicalisation process, which is used to help train trainers or individuals or caregivers or the local community about the different stages of radicalisation. So as you can see in the left-hand photo here, we've got 3 stages for both the Loyalist and Republican. So for stage 1, that is 0 to 6 months. That's quite the early process. And during this, you will walk around a bedroom and try and find the relevant indicators that might suggest that someone is being radicalized or they may be at risk of being radicalized. So in stage 1, there is usually little to see. There's not a lot of indicators at this stage, but there might be slight causes for concern. In stage 2, this is where there is a significant increase in the radicalization linked materials. So there might be an increase in books linked to particular groups, or there may be posters on the walls, which in some cases we included posters linked to Palestine conflicts. We've also got newspaper cuttings across the room, and there is association with drugs. You can see weighing scales, calculators, and that sort of thing there. And then as you move on to stage 3, this is where the most critical cause for concern was highlighted by the experts in Belfast. So we found that once we had seen all of the materials in stage 2, these are all completely wiped away in stage 3, and you can no longer see any of the previous materials. And this is the critical stage that they found was the most cause for concern, to suggest that this person is being radicalized, because they have removed all association with the extremist or militant group, and they are really increasing their methods to be more private and securitized within their home. So for the next scenario that we developed, this is based on recognizing misinformation online, and I'd say that this is more of a generalized scenario that is based more towards the educational and reaching hard to reach communities such as young people. So this scenario is focusing on how extremist groups can create and distribute misinformation online, which can divide vulnerable communities and encourage hate towards certain individuals. So this scenario is aimed to be used, as I mentioned, in education, and it targets young people in particular who are often disengaged by traditional counter-radicalization methods, which usually involve a lot of PowerPoint and a lot of speaking, whereas this method, using virtual reality, gives a much more practical and engaging approach. So as you can see on these images, the participant begins with a single news heading online, which is, for this case, it is a news source detailing an attack in Israel. And from this, they can walk around this underground warehouse, if you may, and look at each of the different projectors, which will each represent a different extremist group. So the extremist groups we've included are Islamist, extreme Zionist, far right, and left wing. So for each of these projectors, they are given a, oh, my screen's gone. Hold on, sorry. Can you see the, oh, you can still see, okay. So for each one, you can basically take a highlighter and you can highlight on the screen which areas you think are misinformation or sharing of bias. And from this, after you have done this on each of the 4 perspectives, you can go back and pull a lever, and based on that, the real misinformation will be highlighted. And this was designed to try and create more discussion and engaging conversations with young people, either as the participant in the VR themselves or by watching their classmates or friends use the VR as well. And yeah, as you can see from these 2 scenarios, we've really tried to develop a more interactive and engaging way to educate, raise awareness of, and counter radicalization. So I guess I just wanted to finish with a few quick ideas of the future trends that we might see, which we need to focus our counter-radicalization methods towards. So I think firstly, more needs to be done in addressing the growth in far-right extremism and radicalization processes that they're using online, such as the adoption of mainstream social media influencer culture. I think this is really important to seeing how they are intertwining mainstream culture with extremist culture and are trying to impose that their culture is mainstream, whereas in fact it is exposing extremist values. And secondly, I think that future methods need to look at raising awareness of the movement of far-right politics far-right groups into politics. I think particularly throughout Europe, you can see the transition of far-right extremist groups going in towards politics and trying to influence social and community values. And I think serious game methods in particular can try and show and try and move towards this curve of tackling both of these sections and countering radicalisation in a much more engaging and practical way. Thank you.
Super, thank you so much, Alice. That actually provides some very interesting perspectives on the role of technology, but also the evolution of the radicalisation process. So I'm sure there are questions already coming in that regard. But before we dig deeper into those, I'm going to ask Patrick to give us the end user perspective. I'm not going to chat any further, so I'm just going to hand directly over to you, Patrick. Oh.
Okay, yeah, I'm good, thanks. Thank you also, Alice. It's really interesting to see and to learn how VR applications are raising the awareness and giving a look and feel to countering violent extremism.
Patrick, I think we lost your sound briefly.
Yeah, the sound. I'm back, I think.
Okay,
is that
perfect.
Correct? Yeah, something happened. I don't know. But first of all, what I just mentioned, that I was really impressed by the things that Alice showed, giving a look and feel to how technology can be used. What I would like to do in this presentation is to give you a brief overview in what technology can mean very generic. So technology cuts across in all domains. And what we most often do not realize that the importance of sharing best practices. So the outcome of this project could be very useful to be disseminated and exploited to others. And best practices always are looking quite simple, but it means that you will have the right people in place, the right attitude, the right technology, and the right operational skills. But if technology evolves, but also if things are changing in, let's say, society in which violent extremism is taking place, you need to be aware also that you need to adopt new technology. And therefore, a database such as in your project is very useful to see how it can constantly be improved, adding new tooling. And this means also that we need to work closely with research and security organizations, technology organizations, and small medium enterprises. And the third step is about research. I think there is a continuous need to continue with research on this topic because it changes every day. So this is also a bit more a short-term, mid-term, and long-term approach, which is quite meaningful, I think, for the way you can work with technology. Another statement is that technology is not important. It's not important on itself because it's just a part of a bigger wall. So these are the bricks we are using. So technology is important, but also the legislation in which you can use technology is really important to be addressed. And another part in this is training, education, and culture. So this counts for how you will use and apply a virtual reality, but also how you are working on the internet, OSINT tooling, dark web tooling, but also how to use technology in general to counter radicalization. Another part is, of course, about standards and procurement. Procurement can be quite difficult sometimes for law enforcement because we're always behind. We don't have that much innovative procurement opportunity to buy the latest and the newest. So that's something which can be addressed in a project like this to point out what is the latest and the newest which is available and can be used. And of course, it's all relate and refer to the business change in countering violent extremism. And these building blocks are really important, but it's also important to be aware of this in the next following policy discussion, that technology is not standing on itself, but it's part of a bigger play. What I would like to mention also that, and this is based on the work that has been done by the Spanish Ministry of Interior, partly also, we still don't have something like a single search engine and a common platform, ICT related, in which we can detect and exchange information on possible terrorists who are entering as refugees. So we can run AI and big data techniques on this to detect possible errors offered in an interview. And that's very useful because the analysis of this information across Europe can point out how this extremism is brought in by refugees. Another part I would like to mention is a coherent approach in border checks. Europe has many member states. Not all have the right access to technology, but what we learned also is that when people are crossing the borders, wherever they're from, they all will have a mobile phone, a smartphone. And in which way is there data on that phone, for example, that can refer and point out any signals for radicalization? In which way can we collect this data and bring this also into a single database in which we can learn how people will move if they are a potential threat, or if we can learn in which way they are connected with other peoples. So this is, I think, one of the biggest points we can learn from is that the collection of data on those border checks. A very important point is the detection of potential violent extremism. And then you're talking about various sources. So it can be on Twitter, online, in any kind of open sources, but also just mentioned, if it goes black, if it goes dark, people will connect and use encrypted tooling, which are extremely hard to crack. So encryption in this way, when they are getting into the silent mode, is one of the main concerns also for us. But I still think that we can work a lot to have a better tooling in place in which semantic video, photographs, and video analysis in social media and open sources can help us to point out what goes on. And it's about trends. So you can more or less recognize trends and conversations and put also the words in the right perspective, because most often people are using a kind of slang. But then it goes also to the content, and the content can be openly shared, but also when it goes black and dark, you need to have the right access to tooling which can help you to crawl the internet and the dark web. It's very important, I think, that whatever we speak about in the use of big data, machine learning, immersive technologies, control centers, and mobile technologies, it's about a multidisciplinary approach. So it needs a firm coalition of working together with law enforcement, security organizations, private industries, and policies to come up with a potential in which we can detect and prevent and mitigate the terrorist and criminal threat on the internet. I think that it's one of the hardest things we can do, to have this like a continuous platform or a continuous running project in which things like this are being shared. Other part is the biometrics aspect and the shared database. It refers to the single search engine, single source ICT application, but I think that we still can improve a lot in biometrics, although it has been quite mature, but also there are other ways to have a quick access to fingerprints, but also an estimation of age when people are crossing borders are very important. I think one of the biggest and main challenges in the future is that the artificial intelligence and AI big data assisted tools are really important. There are a couple of phases and stages in artificial intelligence, but for now we still already have access to AI, which can give us a simulation on how radicalism or violent extremism will behave. So this is also a good opportunity to use the data we have and to see if there can be something like a prediction how this will be spread. And we just saw some really good examples in this VR tool, but this is based upon a scenario. But I think with artificial intelligence and having access to more data, we can have more prediction how this will behave. And I would like to stress also the importance of a continuous tech watch and a pan-European cooperation in CVA, as the development of platforms, let's say testing the tooling, getting to a standardized approach, collecting data, is something that has been done already in various member states. But we need to have something in place that will have a joint statement and a joint mission to improve this daily and daily. So technology in this can be very helpful, but technology not being used or technology not being used by people who know how it works or what it can do is then also quite useless. So I was, I think, quite short in this, but thank you for this. And I would say that's all, folks.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That was indeed some challenging needs indeed, but some very interesting areas for development, certainly food for thought. I'm sure this has raised further questions from our audience. So while we're aggregating the participant questions, we're actually going to launch our audience poll, which we'll do through the GoToWebinar platform. So if participants would like to respond to that, and we will gather our questions together. So there we go. The poll should be available to you. Let's have a look. And then we'll jump into our Q&A.
Meanwhile, when we are waiting, it could also be a nice suggestion to see if our ENLETS community, which is working on cyber and OSINT, can get access to the database that has been developed to see what we can do and what we can add to this database.
Oh, well, I mean, I'm sure there's a possibility to share that at some point. It's going to be put on the website in due course, so we would certainly welcome their feedback on areas that are missing or on ways that it can be presented to be used more easily. I think that's the challenge with actually just sharing a database, is actually understanding where the user needs are. What are the questions they ask when they find when they have a list of technologies? What they ask for? Is it only on cost? Is it that they're looking for something that doesn't require a lot of training? Is it, you know, these are certainly issues that the Mindful Act project team were asking as we were developing it, and there's certainly room for an evolution on that front. So we can certainly discuss that. But what we'll do is we'll make we'll make it public once it is available online, so that that you can follow that.
Great.
So let's have a look. So I'm going to launch into some of the questions because I know we are short for time, and then I'll come and we'll review the results of the poll at the end. So we have a question here, which is towards Patrick. Do you think there is a willingness amongst Europe's law enforcement agencies to create this one, sort of create and use a mutual database for search or search engine for data collection?
I think that if I look upon other European policy and developments, that, for example, on the level of EU LESA, they are bringing together the databases that are relevant, and it's called a single search engine. So based on the national legislation, European member states are sharing data, which gives us more access to data which has been stored into various databases, which really will be a step forward. And it then relates, of course, to identification, who is who, and that kind of information. If there's a fingerprint in the database, and it is also connected to other information. So yeah.
Okay. Super, thank you, Patrick. We've also received a question, which I think perhaps Alice is best placed to answer. When you're talking about the development of VR tools for CVE, there are multiple different users that could be involved in actually procuring and rolling out the technology. Who do you see as being those users? I mean, obviously we've got law enforcement here today to be one of the main employers of this kind of technology, but who else might be using it?
I guess as I showed with the scenarios, it's a very good question. I think that it's really difficult because it really depends on the context. So I guess for the Belfast-based scenario that we developed, that was based mostly for law enforcement to show, for trainers and for new officers to show the different types of the radicalization process. But I guess it could also streamline into directed towards caregivers or local community members. But I guess as end users go, I'd say that a lot of it needs to be targeted towards those hard to reach communities. So particularly for young people, through using education as well as a key actor. I think by combining those two together, you can really better engage and bring messages across towards young people, because previous traditional methods of presentations and PowerPoints, for example, can be really disengaging, and they don't, I wouldn't say, have very long-term benefits. Whereas if you implement VR into this approach towards young people, or even towards grassroots communities that often are a bit reluctant to take on such big and hard-based counter-radicalisation policies, by bringing in this softer approach that's a lot more engaging, I think you're a lot more likely to see benefits.
Super, thank you. No, that does provide a far wider audience than one might imagine. That well, I've got another question here, which is certainly one that came to my mind when I was listening to Patrick, in terms of the requirements and the needs for databases and further information. Is that the question is, can the European legislation on data protection and the need to have biometric database actually be a contradiction, especially considering that each member of the EU makes their own laws on this? Patrick, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that particular conflict.
Yeah, I was just answering a question. It's also related to the question that Sergio Bianchi asked me via the chat. Of course, there is, let's say, no crime yet, but I think that it would be something in the policy discussion, that if you're crossing the border, you will have your passport, or you don't have a passport in the Schengen area. But it also could mean that if you are applying for asylum, or you're a refugee and you have traveled through the half of Africa via Turkey to get into Europe, it's about that legislation that will enable us to check your identity. So mostly identity check is the legal basis to collect data. So if people have traveled and, for example, either biometrics or data on their telephone will point out that they have been, that the data is not in line with the story they are telling, there might be something wrong. So, and biometrics is then especially a part of identification, but I'm not an expert in this legislation myself, but in a certain point in letting people in, it is a part of the identity check to collect as much as possible data. And then the second part is this data can be stored and can be compared in a later phase.
Okay. Thank you, Patrick. Again, a very challenging issue indeed. I'm looking again at our questions. We have got quite a few coming in, so I'm going to just see where we stand with them. Again, for Patrick, we have a question regarding the databases that you're calling for. Do you have any examples of the indicators of violent extremism that you would like to include in the database, or are they more identity-based databases, effectively?
I think that you can determine certain levels in this. So firstly, one of the levels would be if there's an investigation, so there's a potential serious threat. Secondly, another level you can share is if there are trends that are similar in the Netherlands, Spain, and, for example, in Croatia. And then again, it will come, let's say, come to a certain point in which you will speak out about individuals, but that's more or less a level of investigation. But I think the vast majority we can share already is that what we see on the national level as a trend, and compare this with something that is constantly or ongoing in Spain or in any other member state in this.
Okay. And then I have a question here, which I think really is to both of you. There's two parts, so I'm going to read both, and then I think Alice and Patrick, your thoughts would be very interesting. So the first, this comes with respect to the idea of influencers and radicalization. So with the internet replacing other ways to gain audience, do you think that whatever the path, influencers continue to be the most common way of radicalization? And the second part of the question is, speaking with de-radicalizers of Arab origin, it was noticed the importance that they have in understanding signals that maybe we don't, or we're not able to understand. Do you think that until the majority of de-radicalization teams in Europe have a majority of Europeans with an Islamic background, and I'm assuming this is focused towards jihadist terrorism, it will be actually very challenging to act quite efficiently in the de-radicalization process. So yeah, it's do we have the right people in place to deal with that, with specific types of terrorism and violent extremism? Alice and Patrick, I don't know if one or either of you wants to jump in on those.
Sure. I guess with the first question regarding the influencers, I think influencers have taken they are a huge part of the radicalization process now, but I don't think they're the sole part of the radicalization process, because they help to bring in support and raise awareness on major social media platforms, so your more mainstream ones. However, I'd say maybe the second half of the radicalization process happens in these privacy by design applications, such as Telegram or Gab, for example, or maybe Discord in some respects. So I think you've kind of got the two halves there. So you have more of your mainstream approach to the radicalization process, but then you've also got the more harder to reach communities which are developing on these privacy by design applications. So I think, yes, influencers do have a large responsibility in the radicalization process, but I think they're only maybe the first half, and then the second half is moving those vulnerable individuals to the more private applications where they can streamline that process further.
Yeah,
Okay,
what I would like to add
Patrick.
about influencers, I think there's also a strategy possible. I would like to compare with child pornography, child abuse on the internet. We do know that there are certain areas in which children can play a Hebdo game. They can come together, can build houses at play. And this is let's say a very attractive part of the internet for pedophiles. So what we did as police, we have built a police station within this digital environment, and now children are talking to the police. They are walking in this virtual environment to the police station and are telling what happened to them, what they are thinking about, but also if they have been engaged by pedophiles. So I think also influencers, I don't think it's always about a religion or background or religion, but in a way, if we have signals that radicalization is taking place as society, law enforcement, ministry, we could also intervene in this and be the positive influencer, and to come up with different messages than only calling out for violence or aggressive thoughts.
Patrick, actually, this is a very interesting point you raise, because we've had another question about radicalization of minors and how that's being dealt with, particularly in the current environment where education is being done online. And I can imagine there's an increasing activity online of minors, and it's good to hear that there are kind of virtual policing efforts within that environment. I can imagine, and it's nowhere near wide enough at this point to provide full coverage, but the initiative seems very important in the current COVID-19 environment. So thank you for that. I've got another question here, which again, I think is directed towards Patrick. So how do you plan to combine data gathering on a natural person by law enforcement for behaviours which are not an offence effectively, such as radicalisation? Is it in line with the police directive?
Yeah, that's always a critical point, how to collect data, and you have the right legal basis in this. So if there's no offense committed, it's always hard to get biometrics in place. But if it's part of another process, as I just mentioned about establishing the right identity and identity background, we do have some legislation in place which allows us to collect data. It also means that, for example, in the southern part of Europe, where people are entering Europe, we will have, let's say, data streets in which checks in which people are being checked. And part of this identity check is checking data and assuring, comparing, for example, fingerprints. But it's all about legislation, and I do recognize that it's not, let's say, well organized in the legislation, but part of the policy for border checks. Then I think you can more or less collect the data.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Patrick. Not easy questions always to tackle. I think I'm going through some of these questions, and I think we've come to the end of what's come in, because we've got people sharing it via the chat function, but also via the questions function. So we do have some very policy focused questions, which I might keep for our second panel. So what I'm going to do is perhaps suggest, now that it's 11 o'clock, that we all take a very brief comfort break, grab some coffee, get a hot drink, and we will regroup here in 10 minutes, so at 10 past 11. And we will invite our second panel to join us. But let me just say a very big thank you to our first panel, Alice and Patrick, and thank you for answering some really quite tricky questions. We will be bringing Patrick back for the second session, or at least for the Q&A, as we will with Alice as well. So keep your questions coming. But in the meantime, enjoy a brief break, and we will be back shortly. Thanks ever so much. So welcome back, everyone. I think we're going to be starting again soon for our second panel. So I realise you're all waiting with bated breath for the results of the poll of the first panel. So before we launch into the discussion for panel 2, I'm going to give you the results. The question was, where do you see the greatest challenges for the practical application of technology in CVE practice? And actually, we've got quite close results for the most responded answer. So at 32% of respondents, it was end user skills and resources to implement the technology that proved to be the greatest challenge based on the perspective of our audience. And at 29%, so very close, second position was technology development. So that's the next greatest challenge for CVE practice. Below that, the third most important was dissemination and awareness of available technologies at 21%, and then 18% thought funding for technology acquisition by LEAs was the greatest challenge. So not much differentiation, but certainly two areas of focus, I think, going forward. So the training and resources angle for the end users, and technology development, so the R&D perspective. So I think that certainly sets the scene for our second panel. And I'm going to give you a quick overview of who's going to be joining us. I think we've heard a lot about the practical application of CVE technology through the Mind Before Act project, and again also the end user perspective in terms of implementing that technology. But we're going to be looking now at this issue from a policy perspective and exploring how governments and policymakers can work to enable these technologies in the future. And we're lucky to have one of those policymakers here today, as well as representatives of 2 companies that have developed unique CVE approaches. So just to give you an overview of who's joining us, we are going to be talking to Agne Kaarlep, who joins us from the European Commission's Directorate General for Migration and Home Affairs. She has a wealth of experience, including negotiating the regulation to prevent the dissemination of terrorist content online. And she's also responsible for the development of EU Internet Forum, which coordinates a voluntary approach to public and private cooperation in tackling terrorist content online and responding to new trends. So seemingly incredibly busy woman. We're also going to get some perspectives from Patrick, but also we're going to bring in the private sector to talk a little bit more about the technologies available. So we have Jesus Marco, who's representing Technalia, which is Spain's leading technology centre, and he brings a wealth of know-how on security technologies generally, but also their CVE technology, which relies on using physiological parameters monitoring and web semantic analysis. So we look forward to hearing more about that. And then last but not least, we'll be speaking with Rachel Fielden, who joins us to share more of the perspective from Moonshot CVE, which is a young tech startup that is actually making quite significant waves in the counter-violent extremism sphere. So their technology is countering disinformation online through inoculation and counter-messaging campaigns. So again, something very interesting to learn more about. And we look forward to speaking to all of them. But before we do, and we've got some tricky discussions on policy to delve into, I'm going to speak with Sergio Bianchi from Agenfor, who's one of Mind Before Act's partners, and he's going to effectively provide a basis for our discussions now by sharing a little bit more about the technology used in the project's forensic lab by the Interforce Centre of the Ministry of Justice in Italy. And he's also going to elaborate upon some of the opportunities and limitations to preventing and investigating radicalization. So I'm going to hand over to you, Sergio. The floor is yours. Thank you. Sorry, Sergio, we didn't hear you. Have you start again?
It's okay?
Perfect, thank you. And we see your screen.
Wonderful. So I will give you a short presentation on the activities we implemented in Padova by the Italian Ministry of Justice in cooperation with the Prosecutor Office and a number of police forces in order to have practical solution for the use of technologies in prison investigation and prevention. A preliminary note, I think that prevention and investigation are 2 separate fields with very different regulations, very different procedures, very different legal frameworks. However, traditionally, the prevention of radicalization is based on the prison observation. So we have data generated by prison police forces, prison staff, psychologists, educators, through observation activities. These data are usually transmitted to central authorities. In Italy, this is done at regional, interregional level and at central level, where there is an infrastructure called Center for Strategic Analysis, the CASA, which is composed by the 4 police forces and the 3 intel agencies. They analyze the data produced at the territorial level and profile individuals. Risk assessments are based on profiling in order to determine the level of risks. Of course, the parameters used to define who is a radical, what type of risks, what type of threat exists, might be biased. However, this approach is outdated because, as we said since a long time, it fails to keep up with the legal and technological evolutions within the prison ecosystems. The legal evolution are quite easy and are represented by 3 key instruments: the GDPR, the police directive, in conjunction with a consolidated jurisprudence of the European Court and the Court of Human Rights. I would like to underline a substantial difference again between activities carried out within police directive or within GDPR. This is not always considered by the European policies, and this might represent a serious problem because unbalanced, disproportionate policies and activities in this field, particularly when we speak about the use of technologies, might be a push factor towards violence and towards more radicalization. The technical dimension is represented by the new mass of digital data generated by the new technology deployed within prison management. We have digital identities, digital files, VoIP calls, electronic payments, cameras, surveillance tags for probationer and other people under surveillance, and so on. So from one side, we have a traditional approach on prevention based on observation, physical observation within the wings. On the other hand, we have the evolution of technology. We tend to generate a bunch of new data. Therefore, our problem was, our starting problem where we decided to implement the lab in Padova through the project Mind Before Act in cooperation with another project supported by the DG Justice was, how can we technically test technology and use technologies with end users, so police forces, judges, prosecutors, people involved, volunteers and NGOs, vetted NGOs involved in prison activities in a real environment. How can we do it? So we bought a number of technologies in cooperation with several European companies, and we started a massive test, which is today a continuous activity. The lab has been established in Padova by the Triveneto Prison Administration, but very soon became a national lab because all investigative bodies at European, at Italian level, in all regions today use the technologies and the expertise and the people trained within the Padova Forensic Lab for their own preventive and investigative activities. So the first technology, I can tell also the name, is a Mercure software used to analyze links and phone calls. The software is quite powerful. There are a number of similar softwares on the market. What we analyze within Mind Before Act is the compatibility of the data generated by these softwares with the rest of the security and preventive infrastructure in place within the Italian system, so within the Italian Ministry of Justice, but also in cooperation with the investigative body by the Padova Prosecutor Office. Second one is data integration. So we bought a couple of softwares for forensic extractions from mobile phones, because today mobile phone is probably the major challenge we have within the prison system. This is a simple example. This small Chinese phone here, there are thousands of, let's call it illegal. It is not a proper definition because the introduction of a phone into a prison is not an offense, it's not a crime, but it is an administrative violation. However, these telephones can be used to commit crimes. when they are found into high security circuits, high security prisons, in the hands of mafia-style organizations, or in the hands of people convicted at different level of the legal proceedings for terror-related crimes, they are an important indicator. So there is a tendency to pass from forensic evidence, which moved from the physical world to the new digital world. The second major threat we are recording are drones. That's the reason we have today a counter-drone system within the prison. We tested several drones. We are all drone pilots. We trained a number of prison officers within the lab to be experts in this area. And we started a cooperation with different companies producing drones with the final objective of extracting, getting data from drones captured within the prison. And there are very important data within the prisons. So these are only two examples of the major threats we have. Therefore, data extraction from telephones, which is a forensic activity, therefore, it requires an authorization by judiciary authorities, prosecutors, or different type of authorities of European level is very important. The third one is drones, as we say, because drones represent a new frontier. Through drones, you can do a lot of activities in prison, and we noticed that several organized crime groups tend to use drones to transport equipment, SIM, drugs, information. So a lot of things can pass through drones. The evolution of the drone system is very, very important, because the cost today of a small quadricopter is very inexpensive, and it's easy to manage it, and therefore this is a new horizon for our security. The last pillar of our lab is virtual and augmented reality. Virtual and augmented reality, which can be used for training, as we have seen from LEAs, but also for operative purposes. We are developing, in cooperation with one of our companies, quite a lot of digital contents for virtual realities with different platforms, with multiplayer platform and single player platform, in presence and online. This is an example of one activity done within Mind Before Act and another project on how to organize a prison search. So we have an environment, very high quality environment of a prison cell, where the individual can enter into the system. We have different tools for scanning, for analyzing data while carrying out the search. We have to find a telephone. This is an example of telephone. We have 3 telephones. Then we have to extract data from each telephone. And the operation can be guided by a trainer. We have to extract data considering the security chain, so how to maintain the forensic chain in a proper way to avoid that the data cannot be used in investigation or not to be authorized by the prosecutor office. So this is a simple and quick example of the lab. The lab is available for everybody, as well as the different stations for virtual reality. We plan to expand the stations for virtual reality at European level. So in the next weeks, we will make proposals to a number of European partners to have free of charge our virtual reality equipment in order to have a station, a distance station, to use virtual reality equipment and to train their own people with this very high quality contents. That's basically, in short, the experience, and thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sergio. I think an excellent place to start our discussions. You really sort of hit the nail on the head in terms of highlighting what we're dealing with in terms of the policy challenge. How do you marry the legal and technical dimensions when it comes to counter-violent extremism? And you've given some very specific examples within the prison environment, but I think these apply just as much in a whole range of other scenarios. So without further ado, and we do have a lot to get through in this second panel, I'm going to hand over straight away to Agne Kaarlep from the European Commission, who is working on the CVE technology and policy. Agne, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me and involving me in these discussions. It's been super interesting to listen to all of you. I mean, we're very firm believers in the Commission that interaction between research, practitioner, and policy level is absolutely essential in designing effective solutions. So it's been fascinating to hear. I think technology can be incredibly powerful in helping us counter radicalization, violent extremism, leading to violent extremism and terrorism. And I think this morning and now also listening to Sergio, I think we heard about a variety of ways and practices which are already being used and which are currently in developing. And especially, I think the super interesting work on the use of VR in countering radicalization and violent extremism, and also in training the trainers. I think that's really promising. It's very, very interesting to hear. So just to say that my area of expertise is in countering violent extremism online. And as a result, when I speak about a little bit about how we think that governments can help and support the technology development and dissemination, my examples will come from this area. So I think from a policy perspective, governments can provide three main avenues to facilitate and support technology development in this field. Notably, these are providing a platform for multi-stakeholder engagement, making available targeted funding, and finally setting a legislative framework where necessary. So in providing a platform for multi-stakeholder engagement, it's crucial that when designing policies or implementing them on the ground, we're able to tap into the experiences and knowledge of a wide variety of stakeholders. In the area of radicalization or preventing radicalization, we've developed multiple ways to provide for stakeholders to come together to exchange and collaborate. From our unit in radicalization unit in DG Home, we run two main things. One is the Radicalization Awareness Network, which brings together practitioners, where you have really some excellent exchanges between practitioners. And in the context of countering radicalization online, since 2015, we launched the EU Internet Forum, which brings together member states, the internet industry, Europol, civil society, and academia to work together in a voluntary partnership to address terrorist misuse of the internet. And I think we've really seen in these past 5 years how building this trust and understanding among the stakeholders has really led to a successful partnership. And the engagement between law enforcement and online platforms really has allowed for both sides to understand each other's concerns. And often what we find that the concerns are very similar between those addressing the concerns of countering radicalization online. So for example, this existing collaboration allowed us very quickly, following the Christchurch attack, where you had a viral spread of depictions of the terrorist attack online, to put in place general lines of understanding how EU law enforcement and industry could interact together should this happen again. And we agreed in 6 months a voluntary framework, the EU Crisis Protocol. More recently, we discussed together on the challenge of addressing violent right-wing extremist content online, where we found very clearly that that both the internet industry and member states law enforcement are actually struggling with the concrete definitions and struggling to define what really constitutes violent right-wing extremism and where are the boundaries, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable under even the national laws. And you have quite a variety of those among the member states themselves. So quite a lot of work needs to be done in really understanding how we want to address this, this issue in our societies. So this is something that we're working on, and we really see that this type of multi-stakeholder platform is essential in building the general understanding of it. Now, the second issue, which is making available targeted funding, I think that's really crucial for governments to do. And in the Commission, of course, the Horizon 2020 funding projects is flagship to this. And this year also, we have a very relevant funding stream, which includes for technologies to enhance the fight against crime and terrorism.
Sorry, Agne, there seems to be a little echo.
No worries. I think it's gone now. So, and there is also a specific subtopic focusing on the development and deployment of technologies and tools, relevant infrastructure to identify terrorist content online and to prevent its re-upload. And finally, I think some of the speakers also touched upon this, which is that in some ways, legislation is really important because it does provide us with the underlying framework and conditions on how we can work together. Legislation also always produces certain challenges in how we can then address it, and it's difficult to always see all the problems when everything is written down. But it is crucial to ensure that we have safeguards, that the rights of those who have least avenues to protect them or least power are safeguarded. It's important to define concepts and also to provide the necessary incentives which allow for deployment of technology and provide the boundaries on which you can deploy them. And one of the key aspects which we're currently working on is the negotiations on regulation. In 2018, we proposed a regulation to prevent the dissemination of terrorist content online, and this is in its final stages of negotiation now. And this would in effect provide a definition of what constitutes terrorist content online, that we don't currently have a definition. We have definitions of criminal offenses, of course, in the terrorism directive, but what does actually constitute terrorist content? So the material definition we still don't have, and it also provides for the safeguards for both users of online platforms and citizens to complain if any decisions are taken wrongly. And also those some platforms offer those currently voluntarily, but many don't. So it really unifies these obligations and at the same time safeguards. Yeah, so this is, I think this is a short briefing of what we think that governments are really essential in doing and how they can really facilitate. And hit me with any questions you would like to.
Thank you, Agne. Well, I think you raised some very interesting points and actually reflects a lot of the discussions and frankly the questions that came up during the first panel were a lot about the definitions of what our speakers were referring to, you know, about the databases, about who the end users are, how everyone understands the different parties in this discussion and different actors and the different crimes, if you want, or different approaches. So I think certainly coming to a common agreement about all of these different issues is vital, and certainly an area for policymakers to be at the forefront of. I'm sure we have a lot of questions for you. I realise we also have a very busy panel, so I am going to jump straight in to get the perspective from our private sector representatives, because we've not yet heard directly from them. I know we do have 2 representatives. We were going to hear from Jesus, who I know is online, but we do not see him. So I don't know if he's available to.
Yes. Hello. It's Jesus Marcos.
Hello, Jesus. You are
Okay.
joining us live on our virtual roundtable, and I know you would like to share a little bit more about the work that Technalia has been doing in the area of CVE. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for the invitations. Yes, okay. I have here a presentation that probably is going to be shared with you in the screen. Basically, we have So we have been mentioning this participation with what we call it technologies for detecting suspicious behavior, because at the end, the people like us, technical center, we do maths, and how do math applies to the radicalization is sometimes difficult to say. But if you pass next step, my interview will be basically providing some technologies in where Technalia has been investigating and developing for using on these activities of radicalist detection. So next slide is basically where are located our activities in the area of security and defense, and particularly what we have done in this area is done by our line called Trust, that basically focus on activities related to IA and big data analysis, virtual reality, and so on. The activities for violent extremist countermeasures, we have been working on identification technique like video recognition, as been mentioned before, early detection of suspicious behavior based on bioparameters, cognitive bias. This also has been done. Forensic trace analysis and containment to keep and preserve the cross contamination of these forensic traces. Securitization and against hackers, and basically this has been done in the area of critical infrastructure, but also in the area of routines, UAVs, and this kind of thing, avoiding spoofing, jamming, and these elements against potential attacks. We are also working on the IoT protection, basically with the different techniques for blockchain and this kind of elements for protecting the IoT communication. And also we have been using artificial intelligence techniques for prognosis. And in this line, we have been now engaged with some Delphi methods, so how to use math for a better definition or understanding this fuzzy area of what we understand by terrorist definition. And we have been working also in the past in the semantic search through the web, so identified the relation between people and establish on searching to find suspicious behavior. In the experience that we have bring here, we have a couple of proposals that in the context of EICT app, which was the creating a honeypot in a controlled environment used to assess with radical context in websites how the radicalization occurs. So basically, detecting the reaction through these people watching these websites. So like speed typing, page break, physical measure like sweating, breathing, tension, these kind of things can be measured. And with this, we can detect is behind the screen there is some behavior that we can consider anomalous, and we can start to get some alarm. Yeah. So a proposal was also in the line of with Israeli scholars that we'll talk later. Source was an activity, a network, where we have created, let's say, more by a kind of group of radicalization as an experiment for populist radicalization. And in this line we're using this IA semantic search foresee how the radicalization was let's say moving. No, and in this line, the problem was how to understand. I think it's something we can raise in the debate later on. This definition of radicalization. What in some cases there is some fuzzy area between what means freedom of expression and what means a security problem and what becomes a real terrorist behavior, no, or radicalization behavior. So we know that we have been sitting up in the Basque Country for more than 70 years, so I think we have been living very close to these kind of problems. In any case, we understood that the semantic analysis and these kind of things were not very helpful in the definition. So we have been talking about technical innovation and how the maths can be applied for this terrorist behavior. And nowadays there is a study in where we have been involved. There is basically of going in the definition of this radicalism or terrorist behavior. Now there is a cross-border action. In this sense, there is some activities that goes more in change the strategy. So in North Europe, countries probably are more habituated to treat this problem in the both ways, as a kind of let's say political problem and also moving to a social treatment. In the South Europe, this was not so clear that we have a strategy behind this to treat radicalism in a kind of element for social responsibility. In this sense, this cross project was going in this direction. The recognition of this cognitive bias and social action, no? Like for instance, in the Basque Country, there is now a new program called Ustartu, that is a regional action for that we can call it or classify it as social innovation, basically based on the Plan de Convivencia de Derechos Humanos, a kind of proposal of pedagogical solutions at the schools to, let's say, to change the radicalization dogmatism, these ideas with pedagogy or limitation, positive values, ethical conscience, these kind of things. And also personally involved in some local action in how to do the insertion in the society of these, let's see, people back from the terrorism in this sense. No, this is kind of action-related sense developing an identity. So this is, as I said, my message. There is technology for using math and other techniques for detecting early behaviors on radicalization, but there is also innovation in terms of the social technologies, and this is an area where we should explore more. I have here in my last slide group of answers to the questions of the debate that you have been proposed. And this is how the governments can better, let's say, support their R&D in this field. And I think this is basically in the sense of a better definition, as was mentioned before. So method to distinguish criminal versus terrorist is something that now start to be moving from a, let's say, more a clear definition to a more, let's say, an area of where more things can be considered in this sense, also with the regulation and legislation in each country. No? And the things is how to move from math to interpretation. I think we need kind of, I suggested something like a kind of training camp. So for sharing what the math and the technology can do with what the police or LEA expert have intends to demand. So this is something that we should learn each other. The improving of acquisition of these UV technologies, I think defense has been shown in Europe always a clear way of aggregate demands with this pooling and sharing strategy. So, and this is something that we can help also in the security component. And which are the difficulties in this sense for the policy? I think the regulation of privacy is an area where we have to be taking care. I think when we use the I methods and logarithms, we are working now in that these logarithms becomes fully transparent, so that people understand how the data are being used, what for, and how it's being processed. In order, if we have received any information or classification in the database, we should know why and how it's been working this. I think this is transparency, and this is also traceability of the tools. This, I think, is our, there's a compromise with the ethical behavior of technology. I think more or less I cover your expectation, the idea of how the technology that we are doing in Technalia, it goes in this radicalization detection.
Super, thank you very much, Jesus. I think that was a really extensive range of inputs there, and you've covered a lot of the ground that we discussed in the first panel, as well as what we'll be looking at in our Q&A after this panel. You raise a very interesting point. I think that when people think of CV technology, the immediate imagination is with regards to sort of analyzing large swathes of data and using algorithms and maths, as you put it, to review that content and to identify threats, whereas there is obviously social innovation as well as a channel for CVE that shouldn't be forgotten. And I think Alice, who opened the session, covered some examples of how VR is doing that, how local communities or how caretakers and educators might be able to use this kind of VR technology, for example, in a more social, innovative approach. That said, I could talk about this for a very long time, but you're not here to listen to me talk about these things. You're here to listen to the experts. So I am going to say thank you very much, Jesus, and I'm going to hand over to Rachel Fielden for another technology developer perspective on some of the approaches to counter violent extremism. So over to you, Rachel. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction, and it's been great to listen to my fellow panelists who offered some really great insights so far. Again, my name is Rachel Fielden, and I am a senior analyst at Moonshot CVE. Moonshot CVE is a social enterprise based in London in the UK, and we call ourselves a social enterprise because we are essentially a tech company with the mission of countering online harms in all its various and ever-changing forms. But primarily, this includes violent extremism and disinformation. Very briefly, I'll just describe the way that we do this. So we use a number of in-house technologies as well as open source intelligence tools to monitor as well as counter violent extremist activity online. Our flagship technology, which you may have heard of, is the redirect method, which was developed in partnership with Google and seeks to pair at-risk individuals looking to engage with violent extremists online with alternative or counter content. This may be in the form of videos, music, or literature, and in some cases may involve intervention pathways, such as one-to-one private chats with trained therapists. We do this by co-opting existing methodologies that are used within the digital marketing space, predominantly advertising techniques, in order to identify those who are indicating at-risk tendencies or willingness to engage with violent extremist content and pairing them with the content that we offer, alternative content. Our work in the policy advocacy space, on the other hand, is fairly limited. As mentioned, we're primarily a tech company, so most of our time is spent trying to come up with tech innovations for the problems we face as a society. When we do get involved in policy discussions, we try to do so when we think that we can be most useful, namely in providing data-based evidence or expertise for a policy-based decision. So in the US, we were involved with providing expertise to the House of Representatives on the designation of violent extremism. So our involvement in this more specifically was to ensure the recognition and inclusion of far-right extremism in the US policy space. We were also involved in the Christchurch call to action in the wake of the Christchurch attack in New Zealand. During these meetings, we vouched for the inclusion of alternative methods to countering violent extremism online, other than content deletion or removal, making sure that those policies were bolstered by other intervention methods. We argued that policies that only are one-sided, that only include a dictation of the removal of content from social media platforms, would not really stop those who wanted to access this type of content from accessing it elsewhere, and pushing vulnerable individuals to sinister echo chambers online, and ultimately increasing their risk of radicalization. But also, it is a missed opportunity in the de-radicalizing space. It's a missed opportunity, rather, to de-radicalize at-risk individuals in a space that's relatively transparent and regulated. When asked the question for this panel about how government and information sharing can support our work, other than what I've already mentioned, two things come to mind. This very much echoes some of the points my fellow panelists have already mentioned, so I'll try not to be too repetitive. But the first is to provide a mechanism for people to get help in the early stages of their radicalization. For example, Prevent, a government-run scheme in the UK, despite some of the good work it's done, has alienated those who wish to seek help for themselves or peer or family member without potentially causing themselves permanent legal ramifications, creating a lot of distrust between these communities and the policing forces, which I believe Alice mentioned in the first panel. It's possible to provide this mechanism in an ethical way using technology that already exists. For example, you can understand trends online where extremist material is being accessed and shared without necessarily accessing or sharing any personally identifiable information, making sure that at those specific places, these people are met with counter content and interventions that provide them with an alternative path away from radicalization. This ensures that people are getting helped not on what they look like, what their age is, gender, or religion, but because of their exhibited behaviors of wanting to engage with violent extremist content online. Obviously, this is for a very pre-criminal, early stage of radicalization, and this does not speak to the very engagement with more violent, physical, real-world activities. The internet is a really rich source of these identifiers of pre-criminal activity and willingness to engage with violent extremist content. And this can be accessed under GDPR and used to provide means of appropriate interventions according to the level of indicated risk. A way that this can be implemented is through knowledge sharing and through network building between technology makers, experts, and policymakers, much like what Agne mentioned in her presentation. I'm not sure I have much time, but I'll try and quickly sum up my second point, which is we need to be as knowledgeable as possible of how larger tech companies are functioning, how extremism functions on their platforms in really specific detail. What exactly are they trying to do to tackle and exercise a duty of care over the space that they've created? For example, Facebook this weekend announced that they'd be using metadata to put content warnings onto messages containing violent content on Facebook Messenger. This has already been done on the newsfeed and on Instagram stories. On WhatsApp, they've limited messaging forwarding to only 5, significantly hindering the spread of disinformation by malicious actors, and doing so in a far quicker and probably more effective rate than any of the work I've personally worked on, and many other people I know that work in the disinformation field. And on Reddit and Twitter, they're also quarantining problematic communities and content rather than deleting them. These efforts aren't going to end extremism alone by any means, but they're examples of what we need to be looking out for and acknowledging if we want to create these small, easy changes in order to place effective and meaningful barriers to violent content online. We should be seeking to work and collaborate with tech companies, legislating, but also trying to deeply understand these small elements where small tweaks can be made to impose these barriers and bolster CVE efforts online. And again, this can be done by developing knowledge, sharing knowledge and skills with technology available. I believe I've run out of some time now, so thank you very much for having me here today. I look forward to answering your questions in the Q&A session. Yeah, thank you very much. Bye.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rachel. No, I think you've certainly touched on some critical points, and I think the challenge of making the small changes and encouraging large tech companies to make seemingly small changes is a very big challenge for policymakers. And I'm sure Agne is working extremely hard to encourage such the small tweaks that are necessary. I'm going to give it perhaps a last word to Patrick. I know we weren't going to sort of repeat the conversation from panel 1, but I did want to give you an opportunity to revisit the discussion from a policy perspective as opposed to a practical one, just in terms of your view on how you see the end users benefiting from policy initiatives in the CVE sphere. If there's any elements you want to add from our earlier panel.
No, what I would like to add is that I would be interested to see what goes on in the project. So what Agne just told us about her activities, but also Rachel and Sergio, and how we can intertwine this into activities from the end user perspective. So from ENLETS perspective, we, for example, have a cyber group, and that would be great to explore what has been done in the project, but also in the area of DG Home, what Ram is doing, and to bring together, let's say, 15, 20 experts, and to get into the content and to discover what has been developed, if it's applicable for us, if there's some advice, or if we can strengthen this capability, add more tooling, and add best practices, etc. So that will be more or less my remark. I do not have really policy recommendations, but I would like to keep it practical and to see if we can support bottom up to get this capability in place to learn and to add what has been done. That would be my interest in this.
Thank you, Patrick. No, absolutely. I think bringing together multidisciplinary platforms is certainly a way forward, and I'm sure both from a project perspective and our tech representatives would be interested to contributing more directly to the work of ENLETS, which I'm sure we can manage to organise at some point. What I will do now is I'm going to open our panelists to some questions from our audience. But before we do that, we are going to open our second poll through the webinar platform, just to give us a couple of minutes to gather the questions in. So, dear participants, if you'd like to add your questions either via Twitter or through the webinar platform, do go ahead now. We've just opened our second poll. So send us your answers and we'll give you the results at the end of the Q&A. So we'll take a minute or two just to gather those questions and we'll come back to our panelists. Okay, so maybe we can kick off with just a general question, which I launch towards our panel as a whole, where you see the opportunities for or more opportunities for governments to support research and innovation in this particular field. I don't know if who wants to go first on that question.
I'm happy to speak on that point. From Moonshot CVE's perspective, I believe that constantly growing and developing networks of experts that are diverse in size, in their length of existence, and in their perspectives is really, really important for governments to do. And by growing these networks allows them to the opportunity to learn from one another, and also for them to push for more research and development in certain areas and make advisory comments on what governments can be doing to further their support for research and development.
Super. Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, if I may add something.
Yes, please.
I think that legislation is a key issue because we run two risks with these counter-radicalization policies. The first serious risk, very serious, because can push radical individuals toward terrorism, is the privatization of security. The policy adopted by Europol and other agencies in cooperation with the DG Home, who delegate to Facebook, Twitter, and other organizations the removal of contents lacking any judiciary procedures or risky. Indeed, Facebook has been convicted in several European countries when radical movements, political parties, social movements asked judges to intervene against their decisions. And they have been lucky, Facebook, because the proceeding was a civil one, but there were also legal penal implications. Second one, when we use technology is more powerful than the legal system. When we use platforms, and we are partners of some of the major European producers of these platforms, when we use platforms to scan online contents, we have a number of risks. First of all, jurisdictions. You know, police forces are working within specific jurisdictions. And online activities are going behind jurisdictions. So you risk to profile and to gather data from the UK on individuals, let's UK as an example, on individuals who are in Dublin or in Rome. And this is behind the competences of the police force. Second one, you risk to gather data on minors. You risk on spying on journalists, politicians, member of the parliament, member of the police forces. So you risk to destroy investigations. We have to be very careful when we use these tools, profiling tools, to carry out activities outside the police directive. I'm not sure that the simple declaration of GDPR compliance can solve the problem. So for this reason, just two, but there are many, legislation plays a key role in defining the future of the counter-radicalization policies.
Thank you, Sergio. I think you've raised some critical points there, and we do have lots of other questions, but I do want to offer Agne the opportunity to come back if you do want to say anything as our policy representative on the panel.
No, thank you so much. Yeah, I think you you both raised important points, and I think it's encouraging to hear that we are in that sense in the right track, that we are trying to focus on the right areas, and one of them definitely being bringing people together to discuss these things. And I think also you raised a good point. I think these formats have also really helped in focusing the actions of private sector in-house. We've seen, I mean, from 2015, since we started the EU Internet Forum, to 2020, of course, we have seen, I mean, of course, there's lots of other things have also changed in the environment, which has encouraged private platforms to take more action in protecting their own users from a lot of different harms, not only terrorist content, but we also see an increasing action against disinformation. And so I think the forum has played an important role in providing an incentive and also explaining what the problems are. I think, to bring an example here, larger platforms now deploy countless people to look at the threats on their platforms. But in the early days, and in many cases on smaller platforms with less capacity, which is completely understandable, they may not even be aware of the possible concerns. So this knowledge exchange between the different sectors is absolutely crucial in ensuring that that we exchange the information which law enforcement sort of has on the threat, on sort of high level issues. Of course nothing confidential or etc., but that we exchange this information and platforms become aware of things that are in principle not in their competence. I mean, they didn't start out to look at terrorist threats. I mean, that's not what they started their companies for. So I think that's one of the crucial points. And I think the second one on legislation and the critique of pushing of the voluntary elements, pushing more of the responsibility on private industries to respond themselves. And I think that is certainly something that we've taken seriously. And I think this is also partly why it was important in this area to define what do we mean by terrorist content, and have a mechanism by which authorities are able to swiftly respond and send orders which are legally binding and therefore also subject to all safeguards, redress measures, and including judicial redress. And I think that is also absolutely crucial, and I think you're completely correct. It's just that legislation takes a long time to do and to get right. So this is definitely, I think, something that there needs to be an interaction between these collaborative frameworks where we try and address emerging trends, and we try and collaborate and see what can we do within the existing legislative frameworks. And this also gives us a good understanding of where are the gaps and where do we now need to really define the framework to make sure that the weakest links are protected. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Agne.
If I may, Jesus, yeah, taking some comments on this debate. I'm fully support the idea of this platform of exchange. I think in Spain has been initiated during the last 2 years, also helping by CDTI and by various LEAs, this exchange platform between end users and let's say technological providers. I think this is very useful activity. We have to understand how the technology can be used and which technology exists, and let's say we have to get an advice from the expert that we can not let's say produce the right technology if we cannot are aware of which kind of use will be done. And in the same way, there is more technology probably that the capability to use it. So I think this is something we had to exchange, but not only between, let's say, policial stakeholders and let's say security technical providers. I will extend to more, let's say, mission-oriented networks. So means in integrated other areas, so education ministers, areas of communication, so ministers, so people that engage in the problem, not only from the perspective of political problem, also a perspective of social problem, and this is the point.
Lorraine, your microphone.
Hello?
Thank you. It's helpful if I do put my microphone on. So yeah, thank you, Jesus. We do have a couple of other questions, one of which is quite specific to emerging technologies, and I wondered if some of you or all of you wanted to comment on this. Do you have any thoughts about the possibilities for the development of artificial intelligence in the fight against radicalization, bearing in mind the threat of artificial intelligence crime, which is obviously being commandeered by radicalists? So we have mentioned this, well, several speakers have talked about AI in technologies, but how do you see it developing going forward? If anyone wants to jump in on that one.
We're talking about cybercrime, right?
So whether it's the use of AI as a means of radicalizing vulnerable people or young people or different communities, is that something that's being considered?
If I may, I can just quickly jump in on that one from a very specific point of view. I mean, AI is a tool, so of course it can be used in a multitude of ways. From the terrorist content online perspective, we have noted that, of course, the use of automated tools by industry to suppress the content or to detect the content is proven to be very important. I mean, just a snapshot of this is, of course, Facebook having to 1.5 million uploads of the Christchurch video in 24 hours, and this is just one incident. I mean, the amounts of uploads daily is quite significant, and having a person go through them manually would be very complicated, especially because this type of content is not, it's still rare compared to the other types of content out there. I mean, cat videos, dog videos. I mean, it's hopefully there are more of those than we have terrorist content. So I think it's crucial that we do have automated tools, and that we encourage their innovation, and that they get better at what they do. But this being said, it's also absolutely crucial to ensure that these are operated safely. So if you that they need to be very accurate, especially if they would be full automation of decision making, which is relatively rare still. I mean, there is automated detection, but automated takedown is still quite rare. And so there needs to be sufficient legal safeguards to ensure that when deployed, that all types of remedies are available to then those against whom the decision is taken. So that's one thing which is crucial. And when we, for example, speak about AI in detecting early signs of radicalization, etc., then of course we go even more into this. What's really important is safeguarding and keeping it within the lines of existing legal frameworks. The EU also has AI strategies, etc., coming. So I think this is definitely somewhere where the Union as a whole will take more of a role in the coming years.
Thank you, Agne. I don't know if any other members wanted to contribute on that issue. Patrick?
Yeah, there it goes. I was muted. Now, I would like to add to Agne, you know, that in artificial intelligence there are more or less 5 stages, and the future will learn how artificial intelligence will be really artificial. We do have a lot of in place to automate machine learning, etc., etc. So that is useful to detect, but that's the autonomous part of artificial intelligence to take down a site or to delete information will be probably another 4 or 5 years to go. And also in technology, if you look upon what mostly Gartner does, there is like a curve in which certain technology will be highlighted, and because then we will recognize the importance of the technology, but it will take several years, then it will go down into a slope, and at a certain time we will be able to pick this up. But it will be very useful already to, let's say, in a tech watch scenario, to discuss with research and technology how we see this new artificial intelligence working in our own domain. What are the boundary conditions, ethical, legal, etc. And currently also within DG Home, there's a huge interest and a huge program. Also in Horizon 2020, a lot of calls open to use this, and I hope that the law enforcement will use this opportunity in 01, 02, and 03 to get active and to also produce a roadmap in which we can outline on specific topic what is needed and what are the conditions and what is the best way to get this implemented. So this is what I would like to add. There is artificial intelligence, there are automated systems, but the really intelligent part is just something we need to discover in the future, but we need to be active and discuss this.
Thank you, Patrick.
If I may add a small detail.
Yes, thank you, Sergio, please.
Artificial intelligence can be used also to extract data from virtual reality and gaming simulation in order to have empirical dimensions from theoretical studies without risks. Because in this case, using virtual gaming and extracting data from different simulations, you don't risk to use biased algorithm or biased PNL search engines and so on and so on. So this is something we have in our forensic lab now. You extracting data through traditional platform. We use Intel platform for this. Extract data and then through AI have simulation to produce additional gain then. Because through artificial intelligence, you're able then to define patterns and to re-simulate scenarios, re-simulate cases, reanalyze incidents, major conflicts, and so on.
Thank you, Sergio. Indeed, the theoretical approach certainly offers a more gentle results oriented version of the data gathering, but certainly worth doing. I'm keeping an eye on the time here because there's a couple of things I wanted to do before we round off the discussions. I think there have been a lot of topics that have been raised in terms of how we develop technologies in the CVE space. Notably the sort of ethical privacy concerns, the legal and investigative impacts that they might have. But I think what I gathered for the most part is that there are a whole plethora of different innovative approaches that all our panelists from all their various differing sectors are very interested in coordinating with and ensuring that their various areas of expertise are benefited by these approaches and that they integrate their priorities in an aligned fashion. And I think the results of our poll demonstrate that. So if we look at the question itself about the priority areas for policymakers, we can see that the winning result is 57% of our audience think that platforms for exchange of expertise and solutions should be the priority, followed by a 22% research funding, 13% legislation, and 9% other. We'll have to do some digging into some of the comments to see what falls into the other category, but certainly the Commission is moving in the right direction with the EU Internet Forum, given the platforms for exchange it is such a priority. I think what I'd like to do, just as a sort of final rounding off, is to ask each of our panelists what their perspective is in terms of the one priority for policy change that they see going forward in order to enable the future of CVE technology. So maybe we'll start with Agne. I know you are a policymaker and there's some very defined policies coming forward, but from your expert perspective, what would you like to see as a next step, given some of the areas that we've highlighted today?
I think so. It's actually, I mean, I think we're sort of as we've seen that these things are really important, what we're already doing. So I think what is important from the governance side is we see a lot of these technologies now starting to really develop exponentially. And then when we have exponential development in terms of data speed, data sharing speed, and then also in AI development, and then when those start converging, we start to see all sorts of other fun developing technologies. And I think from a policy perspective, what's really crucial is to find meaningful and innovative ways to connect and be connected with the best and latest ways of addressing threats, and also what are those threats and how they are developing. So I think this is one of the crucial ways. So one is there's multiple ways in what you considered in this panel, or what all the participants who were listening in considered most important, is building these platforms. So there's multiple ways of doing that. And I think what would be most interesting to see is how we can best innovate that. You know, what is needed, how we can build in relatively agile ways of then connecting together to respond to new things, because I think the future is faster than we think, and this will certainly be a challenge for policymakers, because the processes of democracy are by definition slow, and importantly so slow, because it's important that we get legislation right. So merging these two things and providing the right incentives and right frameworks is going to be a real challenge, but it's going to be a real interesting challenge. So we look forward to everyone's contribution to it.
Thank you, Agne. Indeed. I will hand over perhaps to Alice from our first panel. Alice, where do you see the need from a policy perspective?
I guess maybe it would be really useful if we targeted policy development towards the generation and dissemination of misinformation. I think this is becoming more and more prominent, as I mentioned before, with extremist groups moving in towards politics and other areas. I think it's really important to generate policy development towards how this disinformation can be recognised and how we can prevent it and reduce it, and reduce the overall impact as well. Because I think, especially with the generation of things like deepfakes, as Agne was saying, things are developing so quickly. It's really important to stay on top of these different methods being used and prevent them as best we can.
Super. Thank you, Alice. Patrick, from the end user perspective, what would you like to see as a priority from policymakers? Oh, hold on. We didn't hear you again.
Now I'm good. Okay. Now we were talking about innovation, and for me, innovation is like an artichoke. First, you will peel off the leaves, and then you get back to the core. And one of the core is that we need to harmonize, have that pan-European capacity building in place, have that proper exchange, and set a baseline. And then we can innovate based on the gaps and the requirements we have. So I would like to stress the importance of having something like a firm policy and bringing things together, and then also to make sure that maybe in an, let's say, organized way, although innovation is never organized, come up with the requirements and to come up with innovative solutions. And I would like to stress also that there are so many brilliant people available. And if you just put the right people in one room for 2 days, you will come up with a toolbox you never learned of. And that's my experience, especially in ENLETS, that there are sometimes people that are so clever that I can't follow them, so clever they are. So I think that innovating is bringing the right people together, set a baseline, searching for the right opportunities, and maybe to keep in pace with the really expanding, fast-moving technology.
Thank you, Patrick. Perhaps Rachel, you would like to share your thoughts on the next steps for policymakers to support technologies.
Jesus.
Hold on a second, Jesus. I think we were just going to hear from Rachel, and then I'll reach out to you.
Okay, good.
Okay, am I good to go?
Yeah, you are. We can hear you.
Okay. I just want to second everything that Agne mentioned. I think she raised it in a very detailed and nuanced way, the issues between making sure that we are innovating and bringing in research and development at every single possible stage where we can in the policymaking sphere, but in a way that understands the hindrances, but also the very reasonable ways and legitimate ways in which governments and democracies work and function, and the responsibilities that they have. So, as not to repeat, I would stress the need to ensure that whatever technologies we do development and bring on going forward in the future, whether that's through the use of AI or metadata, that we are constantly putting at the foreground indicators and building into our databases a list of indicators that are not built around identifiable stereotypes or features, but really center around risk and breaking down that risk into its multiple levels, from interest all the way to engagement to violent intent. That will provide us with more nuanced pathways for intervention, and also allow for a more flourishing knowledge base for information sharing. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Jesus, would you like to come in with your perspective on policy priorities going forward?
Yes, maybe innovation is not only in one side. So the baddies, as saying that the goodies, they innovate. So it means the terrorist is probably not a picture that we have before. There's a new picture in terrorists. So there is a new definition, so new methods. So the idea of creation biolabs or other tracking. So this kind of people. So means that since the definition of terrorist changed, the methods to identify it, early identify it, must change too. So I think this is something to have a perfection. And again, I think only technologies in terms of web or digital technologies, that exist already are not enough. I think there is also innovation, the social methods that we should use it and prioritize in order to prevent and detect.
Indeed. Thank you, Jesus. And I think we'll also hear from Sergio. I'm sure you have something to add as well.
Yeah, well, I think that we have enough technologies in relation to the type of threat, terror-related crimes we are facing, which is a decreasing threat, by the way, and not huge one compared with organized crime and other type of threats. Therefore, I don't think that we need further technologies. What we need is to extend the powers of the EPO, of the prosecutor office, in relation to prevention and in relation to the use of technology in hybrid investigations. Because when we speak about radicalization, we speak about hybrid investigation, which is in the majority of the country a duty of the intel agencies, not of the police, and therefore has a very specific configuration. And because we are European and we like to be free, we protect freedom, we protect individuals, and we protect them also against the states sometimes. So we have to be very careful when we speak about these arguments, and we give too much powers to security agencies. Sorry for that.
Thank you, Sergio. So I think on that note, I am going to bring the discussion to a close. Thank you all to our speakers for your contributions, to the Mind Before Act partners for sharing the latest updates from the project's work. It has been a very wide-ranging discussion, but it's also been incredibly helpful to get such varied perspectives. I think we could have spent most of the day investigating the topics that you put forward, and I'm sorry that we won't be able to continue further into the afternoon. What I can say is that we will be sharing an update after the event with a summary of some of these policy recommendations that have come out of the conversations. We'll also be sharing the virtual roundtable on the Mind Before Act YouTube channel. So if you missed anything or parts of the presentations, you can see those again. Very much like to thank our audience who all contributed a considerable amount, both in terms of the polling, but also questions, some really interesting ones, some of which we didn't quite have time to get to, but thank you nevertheless for taking the time to share those with us. If you want to keep following the Mind Before Act project, you can find us on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn. So you'll see the next virtual roundtables that we'll be holding, and find out when the project is producing more results. So don't forget to check in there. So thanks again to our panelists. You've been absolutely wonderful, and hopefully if we do this again, we might be able to do it face to face, and I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks ever so much to everyone. Have a good afternoon.